Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome to this episode of History Explored. I am your host, Adam Noyes, and today we're going to be looking at a little something different, not military history related or anything like that. Instead, we're looking at a story that's well entrenched in American folklore, particularly those within the Northwest. So everybody sit back, make yourself some tea, and take a listen. 1923, Upper Unuk River, Alaska. A boy is screaming for his life, standing his ground, aware there'd be no use to running. The bear would catch him no matter what, and it was best to stand firm and make himself look as big as possible. He waved a torch around, hollering, stomping his feet, the darkness making it hard to see. Jess carried 2 guns with him. He had a lever-action .33 rifle and a .38 caliber pistol he used mainly for protection. This particular trip, he was gathering meat for the winter, a trip he'd made a few times now. He knew the area well, had traveled this path before, knew the best places to make camp. But now all his knowledge was being put to the test in this fight for survival. A bear had been stalking him for miles now, days even, slowly gathering its courage to make a move on young Jess. And that time was now. Jess waved his torch, catching brief glimpses of the monster before it would disappear into the darkness of the forest. He could hear it breathing, walking, circling his camp. At one time, the bear charged him, and Jess fired at least 3 times with his .38 pistol. But then it went silent, and this fact probably scared Jess more than hearing the bear circling him. With a loud crash, the bear stormed out of the woods, mouth open, its muscles pushing it forward with a speed almost unheard of. And Jess barely had time to spin around. He hadn't the time to reload his pistol, and so he grabbed his .33 rifle. He fired, each bullet striking the bear directly in the head. The bear kept coming, screaming, roaring, leaping up on its hind legs and dropping itself atop Jess's body. It was now eating him, alive. Jess screamed, feeling every claw, every bite, and the tearing of his flesh as the bear began devouring him, the thing not caring if its prey was alive or not. Its weight pushed down on Jess, breaking his ribs, his legs, any bone the grizzly's monstrous paws laid upon. And in his desperation, the boy fired 3 shots at point-blank range into the beast's jaw, breaking it. But this didn't save Jess. He fired twice more, the shots drowned out by the sounds of the grizzly bear roaring, and a boy screaming for help that would never come. Can you imagine being alone in the forest, nearly 100 miles from the nearest civilization, and a hungry grizzly bear stalking you? I think that'd be enough to terrify the pants off of any man, personally. Well, this scenario is exactly what we're discussing today, and I hope you will indulge me as we recall this nightmare in what might be one of the best-known and most horrific bear stories told in North American folklore. But what makes this tale so frightening is that it wasn't a one-time thing. This story spans a full decade. The story of one large grizzly bear and the Sethington family. Today, we tell the legend of Old Groaner. Friends and family of Jess Sethington grew concerned as 1 week went to 2, then 3, then 4, and he'd yet to return. At first they paid little mind, Jess having gone for long stretches alone in these woods several times. But this felt different for them, and by the 3rd and 4th week, they'd known deep down that something bad had to have happened. A search party of 4 trekked into the Alaskan wilderness, and it didn't take them long to discover Jess's trail. They found old campsites and simply followed them deeper into the forest. But at some point, around Cripple Creek, the trail went cold. It seemed Jess had just disappeared off the face of the earth, and with nothing to show for their efforts, Jess Sethington's family was left without a sense of closure they so desperately wanted. In most cases, this would be a sad conclusion to the story, but it doesn't end there. Instead, this takes a full decade for the trail to pick back up again. Now we jump to 1933. Brothers Bruce and Jack Johnstone decided they'd make their way to Cripple Creek. Gold had been discovered here, and the two considered themselves relatively seasoned prospectors. They wanted their chance to find gold of their own, and in an area full of random amateurs looking to strike it rich. Specifically, the brothers wanted to investigate the Unuk River, a place most prospectors hadn't truly tapped as of yet. With them as well was their hound, Slasher, a constant companion for the two brothers. They reached their destination with little difficulty. Their exertion didn't come until they began searching for gold, combing through rock after rock, looking through one gold pan at a time. By day's end, Bruce, Jack, and Slasher were exhausted. They built a campfire and ate a hearty meal, knowing the following day would be further hard work. But as night settled, and the only light source they had was their crackling fire, they noticed Slasher acting funny. The hound was growling at something, putting both men on edge. Then they heard what they described as a long, low groan, something they both found unnerving and like nothing they'd ever heard before, and with both men being hunters, they knew most of the animal sounds which emanated from the forest. Slasher rose and began growling more, the hair on the dog standing, the sight making Bruce and Jack reach for their rifles. And they were right to do so, as the long, low groan had returned, only this time it was much closer. Yet neither man could see whatever it was. They didn't really need to. Watching Slasher was enough to know that whatever had stealthed its way toward them wasn't any good. Then the groan would silence, leaving Bruce, Jack, and Slasher too afraid to sleep, and the brothers decided to make another sensible move by adding wood to the fire, making it bigger, brighter, their best chance at seeing whatever was now stalking them. Just as they'd began to doze, thinking the creature had gone, they'd hear that groan again. It usually coming from the same direction. This lasted for hours until eventually the groaning thing seemed to lose interest in the men and disappeared. Bruce and Jack were still greatly unnerved by this encounter, but decided to keep the fire going and catch as much sleep as they dared. Toward the end of their expedition, Bruce and Jack noticed the biggest brown bear either brother had ever seen, and it was looking back at them. With every breath, the steam emanated from its nostrils, demonstrating its sheer power. Now, the timeline of this incident varies from source to source. After reading and analyzing this information, the encounter with this grizzly bear took place in 1933, or so I've deduced, so during their first trip, but know that this could be incorrect. What's agreed upon is the following actions. This giant bear charged the brothers, heading straight into the creek. Jack and Bruce then raised their rifles and began firing until they ran out of bullets in their chambers. Several shots had hit the bear, but after the final shot, the bear seemed to disappear below the current. They had just begun putting down their guns when out of the creek stormed that bear, that same bear. The thing dragging its hind legs, a bullet having broken its back. The brothers furiously tried to reload, Slasher barking and getting in front of the men to protect them, but they needn't worry. The strength of the grizzly collapsed, and it was swept down the river. Considering themselves lucky, the brothers went back to their canoe, only to discover it had been ravished by a bear. Its oars had been smashed, a deep hole in the bottom making it completely unusable. The brothers concluded that the bear they'd just killed was likely the one they'd been hearing, and the one to destroy their canoe, and a sense of relief washed over both of them despite losing their best form of transportation. Now, a normal person would never want to venture out there again, but not these two. Despite everything that had happened, the Johnstone brothers decided they'd return the following year, in 1934. Once again, Bruce, Jack, and Slasher made a trek toward Cripple Creek. They decided to traverse further up the Unuk River on another canoe and across the border by about 15 miles to the northeast. Their destination, Sulphide Creek, now known as Sulphurets Creek. Once the men entered the area around Cripple Creek, they stopped for the night and rested. Or they did until an all-too-familiar groaning awoke them. Jack claimed to have seen a mysterious dark shape off one of the trails. He was in his sleeping bag and ready to grab for his .45-70 lever-action rifle. Jack must have been frightened, sure, as any man would, seeing a big grizzly bear stalking you. But that fight would probably be insurmountable compared to what followed. According to Jack, he heard that same groan he'd heard a year before. Just then, Slasher jumped in the way, putting himself between Jack and this mysterious bear, and the hound charged, chasing it off, having a brief battle out of sight. Luckily, Slasher returned unharmed, and the brothers prepared themselves for another possible bear attack, but it never came. It's around this time the brothers started referring to this mysterious bear as Old Groaner. The rest of their expedition went uneventful until they parked their canoe by a well-known mineral deposit. The two prospectors continued their search for gold when they heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. What followed was deep breathing, the recognizable snorts of a grizzly, and Slasher began to growl. Their dog then charged, disappearing into the nearby bushes. Both Bruce and Jack called out for the dog, but they couldn't stop him. They didn't dare raise their rifles in fear of hitting their trusted companion, and they waited with bated breath. They could hear a fight up ahead, Slasher growling, barking, followed by the distinct groaning they'd heard time and time again, and the brothers just couldn't believe this bear had still been stalking them. And they were ready to retreat, but not without Slasher. When their trusted hound limped its way out of the thick brush, the brothers picked him up and gingerly put Slasher in the canoe. Other than some scrapes, likely caused by the brush and not the bear, the dog was fine, and together the team began their trek back down the Unuk River. But as they pulled away, they could hear it again, the thunderous footsteps of a bear and those terrifying groans. Both Bruce and Jack Johnstone must have been some of the most stubborn human beings on the West Coast, because even after all of that, they decided to go back to Cripple Creek another year, in 1935. This time, the Johnstone brothers decided they'd bring along a third partner. His name was George Lemons, and he too was well versed with the Unuk River, and like before, they brought along Slasher, the hound eager for another adventure with his masters. The three men trekked further up the creek, discovering along the way mounds of partially devoured salmon and heaps of bear dung. None of this surprised them, having seen it all before. But perhaps of their past experiences here, Jack, Bruce, and George decided to build a shelter out of logs. They began working one morning, using both downed trees and cutting others to help form a foundation. They worked extremely hard and called it a night, knowing they'd continue the next day. While Jack and George built the cabin, Bruce would take Slasher and go prospect. Much to their delight, there'd been no sign of their bear, and things proceeded as normal. Any bears they did see left them largely alone. After a successful expedition, the team decided it was time to head back home. Along the way, they periodically stopped to do some further prospecting. On one of these days, Jack and George went off to set up a camp for the night. Bruce would take Slasher and put a claim on their surrounding area. This way, no other prospectors would impede them. Evening had come, it having just turned golden hour, and nothing out of the ordinary seemed to be occurring, until suddenly Slasher picked his head up and snarled. This immediately alerted Bruce to the oncoming danger, and not only could he hear that all too familiar groaning, but was not 15 feet away. Up to now, other than Jack seeing a dark mass, neither Johnstone brother nor George had seen this bear. Until now. Out of the bushes charged a massive and deformed grizzly bear with one eye. It was so close, Bruce found himself falling over, his rifle stored by the other equipment and out of reach. But before the bear could maul and devour Bruce, Slasher jumped in its way, biting, jumping, growling, barking, doing everything in its power to divert the bear away from his master. And it worked, allowing Bruce to get on his feet. He leapt for his equipment and grabbed his .38-72 lever-action rifle. Luckily, it had been loaded. Bruce then heard a loud whine, the sound coming from Slasher, and he watched as Old Groaner raised one of its paws and swiped hard at the dog. The claws sliced through him, sending Slasher through the air and smashing against a nearby tree. Old Groaner now turned his attention to Bruce, charging, snorting, foaming at its crooked mouth. But Bruce was now ready. He got a bullet in the chamber and fired, a direct hit. He then fired twice more, and on the third shot, Old Groaner let out a massive moan and collapsed lifelessly. Despite being hurt, Slasher appeared, getting closer to Bruce. He examined his dog, discovering the wounds weren't terrible, and that Slasher would be fine overall. No doubt he hugged the dog then, thankful and lucky for having such a loyal and dutiful friend. Old Groaner, now dead, provided Bruce the opportunity to examine it. Bruce had no doubt this was the bear that had been stalking them for the past 4 years, and now he got a good glimpse as to why. Bruce made the following observations. Old Groaner was definitely a male grizzly. Beside the deformed head, its skin was also leathery, lacking much of its fur. He then bent down and got a good look at the thing's head. Immediately, he noticed it was missing its right eye, and then saw its jaw lacked several teeth, and it appeared to be infected. Its nostrils were also twisted at odd angles, as if it were broken many times and never properly healed. He began to move in, looked to discover more of the strange bear, but heard a snap up the creek. There stood another bear, watching them, perhaps wanting to take claim over the corpse lying at Bruce's feet. On instinct, he readied his rifle, but remembered he was now out of ammo. But just before this second bear could make its move, Slasher again came to the rescue. He charged the bear, barking and snarling, making enough of a stand to drive this second bear away. Then Slasher returned, deciding to sit beside his master. This caused Bruce to be painfully aware of his lack of protection, and so he withdrew toward the camp, to which he told the others of what had just transpired. But night would soon be upon them, and they'd investigate Old Groaner's corpse the next day when they had more time. The fact that when night fell, no one heard the groans of their stalker only reassured Bruce and the others that he'd indeed killed the monster that had tormented them for years. The next day. Jack, Bruce, George, and Slasher made their way to the creek and where Bruce had shot the bear the day before. They brought their skinning knives and hoped to collect the beast's pelt, paws, and skull. Sure enough, the bear remained untouched, its body in the exact same position Bruce had last seen it. But when they moved in to begin skinning the bear, they realized it had been frozen over, making it impossible to complete the task. Jack, George, and Bruce deliberated for a moment and decided to just take the thing's skull. They then went to work, skinning the flesh away from the skull as best as they could, and this revealed even more horrors. Now, I've only found this next tidbit in one source, so take it with a massive grain of salt, but I no less wanted to put it here. Remember earlier when I mentioned that bear which charged Bruce and Jack in 1933, the one that they supposedly killed? Well, upon investigation, apparently they discovered on Old Groaner that he'd been shot in the back, just like that bear that had charged them. They could see where Bruce landed his fatal shot, leaving a hole through the brain cavity. They also got a good look at its teeth, most of them indeed rotting away. The right side showed evidence that it had been shot before, and was heavily deformed from a bullet. So Bruce, George, and Jack weren't the only ones who have come face to face with this beast. The right eye arch had also been shot away, which explained the beast only having one eye. In total, they discovered the bear had been shot in the head at least 3 times, once by Bruce. They even found the bullets lodged into its skull, all of them a .38 caliber revolver. Jack shook his head. "Tough old fellow, wasn't he?" said. "Can't understand how any creature can get its head half shot off and still live." George answered, "And look at its teeth. No wonder he groaned. They're nearly all decayed. Bet he had a toothache most of the time." As the men continued dissecting the skull, they began cutting away the gristle. Its right jaw had been shattered long ago, and never fully healed as a single bone. But lodged in this gristle, and partially inside the deformed bones, were 2 further bullets, meaning Old Groaner had been shot at least 5 times in the head by other men. Using their knives, they carefully extracted each one, and all 3 of them agreed what caliber they were. A .33. This brought up a memory Bruce had helmed in the back of his mind for a decade. He looked to Jack and George, said, "Do you remember back in 1923, a fellow by the name of Jess Sethington came in here packing a .33. He never came out." Over a decade later, the mysterious disappearance of Jess had been solved. Much of this story can fall under an almost folklorish status. Since its original publication in 1936, it has been reissued throughout the years, and each time seems to embellish and revel a little bit more of the story at hand. One thing is for sure, Old Groaner and the parties involved did indeed exist, and in some capacity the story did happen. In fact, the skull of Old Groaner, which fully corroborated the examinations made by the Johnstone brothers and George, is located at the Tongass Historical Museum in Alaska. Finding the original publications for this proved to be rather difficult. In fact, the best source of the original publications I found were blurry screenshots containing snippets of information. But in the 1953 publication, I did find something interesting, an apparent picture of Old Groaner before his decapitation. There's little information on the picture. It's certainly a giant grizzly. If we look at the foliage around it, it does fit the terrain Bruce described in detail. But most notably is the right eye socket. The bear in this picture does indeed only have one eye, and its nose appears to be quite gnarled. But I still see some red flags here. First, in no source that I found did it say the Johnstone party actually brought a camera. I haven't been able to find one. Secondly, and more importantly, look at the fur. This doesn't look like a mangy bear, which does fit the leathery description Bruce provided. In fact, one reason the brothers decided not to skin the bear was because of how little fur there actually was for a proper pelt. Yet this picture, it looks shockingly healthy. So it's my humble opinion that while this is a real photo of a dead grizzly bear, and a big grizzly bear at that, it is an Old Groaner. Apparently, in the original publication, there are also photos of Old Groaner's skull and paws, and I couldn't find them anywhere, so I'm left holding my hands up defenselessly on that. So how much of what I've just told you is myth? How much is fact? Perhaps we'll never know. But in truth, I don't think it's necessary. We all like a good scare, and to me, there's nothing more terrifying than a bear wanting to eat you. And who am I kidding? We all love a good, scary story told around a campfire. Just remember, the next time you find yourself getting that tickling feeling on the back of your neck while you're in the woods, you aren't alone. Something is always watching you. And with that said, I wish you a good night. This concludes our story of Old Groaner. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to see you in the next episode. Take care.